All right. Well, maybe we should just kick this off. We only got about 45 minutes, so let's just get going. And thank you all for joining us today. I am Chris Steinkamp, the executive, the head of advocacy at SIA. But I also want to bring in our two guests, so Adam Fetcher and Jamie. Why don't you jump on with me? Great. Hey guys, how's it going? Thanks for joining us, everybody. Again, we really appreciate your time and this morning, and I think this is going to be a really awesome discussion about corporate engagement on climate change and how companies can really lean into this issue in the most effective way they can. Before we get started, I just kind of want to lay the ground rules a little bit. I know we've all been very used to having Zoom meetings for the past year, and this is a little bit of a different format. I really want you all in the session to jump in with your questions, raise your hand, feel free to join the video if you'd like. We really want to make this a collaborative discussion and really take your questions and discuss things with you. So feel free to jump in at any point. I'm keeping an eye on the chat, and if you'd like to join the video, that's great too. Just let me know and we'll let you in. And really that's it. So why don't we just start with introductions. So Jamie Alexander, the director of Drawdown Labs, and Adam Fetcher, the founder and CEO of Big Future Mission and Message. So Jamie, why don't you give us a little bit of insight about who you are and what you're doing?
So it's great to be here. So I'm Jamie Alexander with Project Drawdown. So you may have heard of Project Drawdown. We really exist as an organization to research, analyze, and then communicate about the biggest solutions to climate change. So we have, at our latest publication, reviewed 80 of the biggest kind of solutions that are up to the task of limiting warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius, which is, what the science calls for. And my work at Drawdown Labs is to really look at how we accelerate the scaling of those climate solutions in the world. So we work with one of the biggest levers out there to do that, the private sector, really helping expand the private sector's approach to how we address the climate crisis.
Thanks, Jamie. Adam, why don't you take it away and give us a little bit of insight into your background and the work you're doing now.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. And it's great to join you, Jamie, and everybody on the session. Really pleased to be here. As Chris said, my name is Adam. I'm a consultant, and I work with businesses to help them engage more deeply in advocacy and activism, as well as sort of a full range of impact-driving activities. My background is sort of a mix of national politics. I worked on both of President Obama's campaigns for president and in the Obama administration. In communications, I was the press secretary at the Department of the Interior. And then subsequently led global communications at Patagonia for several years before starting my consulting firm. And I've worked with advocacy organizations across issue areas, but especially on environmental issues and climate. So I sort of bring that triangle of politics, advocacy, and business to my work and help businesses and brands engage at that intersection in deeper ways.
Thanks, Adam. Yeah, so let's maybe just get into talking about the current situation a little bit. Jamie, can you talk a little bit about the science-based targets and the Paris commitment and kind of this global metric that everyone's kind of aimed at?
Sorry, was that question directed at me? I'm sorry that my internet cut out for a second. Yeah, so I think the question was, where are we in terms of kind of our big global targets?
Yeah.
And I think all of us would agree that we are nowhere close to where we need to be. And I think those global targets were intended to be global targets. So I think the fact that that companies have, understandably taken those global targets and then applied them to each business means that we haven't really even gotten started yet. If net zero by 2050 is our global target, then leading companies should be working much, much faster than that. So I think we are, and there have been a slew of reports that came out this week around, how the largest emitters, the 150 or so largest emitters, And we've got a long way to go in terms of how quickly they're moving, and how much they're actually disclosing to the public about their progress.
What do you guys think needs to change on this? I mean, is it just more work on emissions measurements? And what do you guys think is the hang up? Because obviously we've only got a short amount of time to tackle this.
Well, to Jamie's point, I think first and foremost, we need businesses to be more aggressive in reducing emissions and moving towards net zero. 70% of Fortune 500 companies do not have an aggressive 2030 climate plan, which of course is the year that scientists say that climate change could be irreversible without action. That needs to change. So, we're going to talk a lot about other things that businesses can do besides sort of the core measuring and reducing emissions. But I want to emphasize that is foundational. That is table stakes. And I'm disappointed that more, especially large companies who really have the impact to make change, have not set aggressive climate targets, especially since the business case for doing so is so strong. So that's the first thing that I think really needs to change. And then secondly, I think there's a huge opportunities for brands in particular to engage with their audiences around climate in more deep ways. There's plenty of data that shows that not only are Americans, across partisan lines believing that climate change is an urgent threat to the well-being of our country, a significant majority, but also that, consumers are looking for brands to stand up and act on their values, and act on values that they share and want to vote with their dollars in that way. So I think there's huge opportunity, both in terms of pure impact to mobilize communities to achieve greater climate action on a more urgent timeline, and for brands to grow their businesses, grow their brands, and differentiate themselves based on climate action.
And just to add on to what Adam said, of course, emissions reductions are table stakes, but I think with the IPCC report in 2018, which I feel like was really a rallying cry for the business community, what that called for was transformation, was rapid, far-reaching, unprecedented change, and to simply approach it I'm going to just do the same thing in a less bad way is not transformative. That's not what we're talking about here. We need to I feel like I say this all the time, but it feels like we're in a race, we're in a race to save everything we know and love. And when you're in a race, you don't you don't try to get to the finish line at the last possible minute. We're not trying to get to reduce our emissions by the last possible time that the science calls for. You want to race to the finish line and win, not just saunter to the finish line when they're clearing out the bleachers, and which feels like kind of the current approach.
Jamie, you've written. Oh, go ahead, Adam. Sorry.
Well, I was just going to quickly say, I think business leaders can really relate to the idea of being in a race. That's what it feels like to be a corporate leader, no matter what company you're leading. But we're also in a race with rivals like China, who we are currently losing the battle for success and dominance in the clean energy economy. And I just want to hammer, the business case for strong climate action across the business is about creating long-term shareholder value, again, competing with rivals like China, and creating good paying jobs here at home. There's just so much study and data that shows that businesses absolutely need to be embracing climate action, both in terms of their core business and throughout their companies, to succeed in the future economy. It's as simple as that.
That's so true. Jamie, I've heard you talk a lot about doing less harm. Can you it's a really interesting perspective that, I don't know if a lot of companies really see that, being so close to it. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I think that, that kind of is the standard approach. I think that's starting to change, but the standard approach really is okay, I've got, these are the biggest sources of my emissions as a company. So therefore, I'm going to focus on these areas and do less harm to the environment over time by reducing my emissions that I'm currently, putting into the atmosphere. And I think that leads companies to focus on only their emissions, which is, what we've been talking about. And that's table stakes. Like that's like the absolute floor for ambition, not the ceiling. But I think it also limits like there's 80 plus climate solutions out there that need to be scaled, that need to be leveraged. And there's a lot of other leverage points, to Adam's point, that, that companies have beyond just their own, their operational and supply chain emissions. Like they have policy clout, they have investments out there in the world that are funding things. They have employees who want to be activated, customers, they have, there's all kinds of superpowers that companies have in the world. And so, I think just this focus on like doing less bad over time is just narrowing, and it limits the number of people, employees who can like contribute to it, because it's a pretty wonky, like emissions reductions and like the technical approaches to doing that. Not everyone can see themselves in that, but I feel like when you create this like a bigger goal, it can bring more people in, like more employees with more skill sets or more customers. They can see themselves in it and like figure out ways that they can help the company get there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it also creates opportunities for companies that might not be able to reduce their emissions yet either, because I've seen, in the ski industry, there are a lot of companies that might just not have the resources to really sit down and measure their scope 3 supply chain emissions, for example. But if they are looking much broadly, they can look at political advocacy or mobilizing their employees and customers, all the stuff that you guys are talking about, as another tool in their toolbox, which is really important. So Flip just had a question about, and Adam, maybe you could talk about this a little bit, about shareholder expectations. Obviously, that seems, this as a major obstacle towards progress. Can you just talk about that a little bit and how companies should balance that?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's something I think about a lot. I do think that's, I made a list of challenges before that, and that was the first one that came to mind. But I think, a lot of executives of, publicly traded companies feel trapped because they, I think, want to do more to invest in the long-term success of their company, create resilience, and sort of all the things that are benefits of climate action, but they don't see the immediate payoff in terms of returns on a quarterly basis. And we're sort of like over the last 30 years, like gotten caught in that trap. But there's a few things that I think, can happen here. First, I think executives can look at the makeup of their investors, and I think there's good research that shows that actually, when you really look at it, the majority of investors in public companies are institutional investors who are interested in long-term value, and I think that should give executives confidence to make decisions with the long term in mind. And that brings me to the second piece, which is I think business executives need to stand up to investors and tell them, like, look, if you're looking for maximum short-term gains on a quarterly basis, you might want to look somewhere else. This is a company that is, building and growing for the long term, and you're not going to see the biggest possible payoff. Hopefully, you can still see a great return on a quarterly basis. There's no, it certainly doesn't mean that, corporations need to fail now in order to succeed later. Those two things can go hand in hand. It's just not the way to maximize returns for shareholders, because some of that capital needs to be reinvested in climate action.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it does in many ways boil down to the leadership, right? And for them to kind of say, look, we're going to be bold about this, and we're not going to, we've got to have our eye on a much bigger goal than just the quarterly payout, which I understand is a difficult conversation to have sometimes, but it's almost at the point where it needs to happen.
Yeah, I mean, I would fully agree, and I think especially in this industry, this industry that we're here talking about today, like, I live in northern Minnesota, and people are moving here because winter sports are like disappearing from other parts of the country, and so I mean, it's existential to come, to businesses, especially in this sector, and so I think like the more that we can put not just profit, but like a stable climate at the center of companies' business models, like, because I think that is where it should be. It should be like profit and a stable climate are like hand in hand at the center of, business models, especially in this sector. And then when you do that, then like everything else is easy. Then it's like obvious that you lobby on every climate policy, right? Then it's like obvious that you invest in the things that are going to help build a stable climate. Then it's not hard. Then you're not having these awkward conversations between like public affairs or government affairs and sustainability. It's like, then it's just everything is aligned, and I think that's really, to me, that's where I hope we can go in the next phase of corporate sustainability.
Yeah. I read something the other day and they wrote, and I think it was someone, the head of BlackRock actually said this, that, climate strategy is business strategy these days. Should not be a difference. It's that big of a threat to the future of business. And it's not just in the ski industry, it's everybody. Can you guys talk a little bit about, like obviously Adam and Jamie, you've worked with companies, what are some of the barriers? And we just talked about shareholder value and shareholders, what are the barriers and how have these conversations gone with companies that you've spoken to when you say, look, you really need to be bold about this. This is the time.
Yeah, I can go first on that one, but I'm very curious to hear Jamie's thoughts as well. I think the first is a fear of engaging on a political issue. That's something I hear from business leaders all the time, not just in the climate space, but across sort of any issue area that they might be engaged in. I think, the first point in refuting that is, yeah, sure, in a sort of national political way, there is a big gap between our two political parties. But the truth is that doesn't reflect the people of this country and the consumers that these companies and employees are trying to reach. 60%, I think it was summer of 2020, just before the wildfire season, which was the worst on record. There was a poll that said 60% of people, Americans, view climate change as an urgent threat to the well-being of the country. This year, already after the storms in Texas, it was up to 70%. So there's far greater agreement across party lines than you would expect, listening to, frankly, Republican politicians who are just not representing the interests of their constituents. So I think the political excuse is the first one. And there's also, brands can talk about these issues, and climate is a perfect one, in a perfectly positive, optimistic way. I think during the Trump years, there was a sense that in order to champion sort of progressive values, including climate action, there was a need to do battle against President Trump. There was this singular force, this singular man who sort of represented the opposition. That doesn't exist anymore. President Trump is out of the picture, and we have, new administration and new momentum on climate. And so this is about rallying in a positive manner your stakeholders behind policy action and policy wins. I think that's one of the most important things that the businesses can be doing in a variety of ways. And then the third piece I would say is marketers often don't know how to do advocacy. And sustainability folks might know advocacy, but they don't know how to do marketing. And so I think companies need to, create a way to bring together sort of disparate teams, policy, communications, marketing, impact, product, and learn and kind of teach themselves or get some outside help on how to do advocacy in a credible way. And that's a lot of the work that I do with my consulting, is help sort of lay the groundwork for successful advocacy campaigns. There's one more thing I would mention. I know I'm going on here. I hear from companies, especially around climate, oh, that's not our lane. Maybe they're a company that's sort of fighting for internet freedom, or they're a company that's focused on, racial justice, criminal justice reform. I'm all for companies focusing and honing in a lane that is theirs, that they can really invest in, and be consistent over the long term. That's something Patagonia has done extremely well. But climate intersects with every issue. So saying climate isn't my lane is BS. You need to find how it fits within your lane and make that your business. And I think Ben & Jerry's is a great example of a company that's done this. their lane is, racial justice and criminal justice reform specifically. So the way they talk about climate is through the lens of climate justice, which is a too often ignored part of the climate movement. And they've been able to draw a lot of attention to it because that's what they do. So I'll stop there, but those are a few challenges that I encounter.
I would +1 everything that you said, Adam. I think, yeah, and I do think it's a different world now. Like the excuse that I used to get when we would go to a company and say, like, can you support this bill, whatever the climate or clean energy bill, and they would say like, oh, I don't want to like poke the sleeping, don't want to like poke Trump and like evoke his wrath on our industry or get more regulations put on us if we do this. And now it's like companies can actually help kind of move the Biden administration faster and help give the Biden-Harris administration that they have the backing of the business community, and like they're going to need it. I mean, they have really bold target, a really bold climate plan, and I think to be able to achieve clean energy by 2030, 100% clean energy by 2035, it's like they're going to need the innovation of business and the support of business and like that's going to be like a full economy effort to do that. And so I think it's like, it's not just getting better. I think it has to like shift, like businesses can like be, actively supporting the administration in a really exciting way.
Yeah, I mean, it for sure. And it seems like, with this dysfunction, and not as much obviously anymore, but like the business voice on policy, and I know we're just talking about policy right now, but like that is the thing that's needed to get a lot of these legislations across the goal line. I mean, business leaders need to start weighing in, and we've been talking about this for so long. But it's really interesting too. I think having businesses weigh in on this is so powerful. But I think from an employee perspective, an internal perspective, when you have employees that truly care about this issue, which we know that they do, to see your CEO in front of a Senate hearing talking about how much that company cares about climate change really is a signal to your employees and your shareholders about the values of your company. And it really does go a long way in that respect, I think, as well.
That's such a great point, Chris. I think employees are an often overlooked audience that obviously are critical, integral, and not just your current employees, but your ability to attract talent. Some 9 out of 10 employees say they would rather work for a company that shares their values than a company that will pay them more. And I think that just speaks volumes about the importance of business leaders. I think the example you gave around speaking out on climate directly to Congress is a great one.
Great. Well, I guess that brings me to a question that just got brought up too, is like, if you are an employee, like a middle management employee or a young, just starting out employee, and you care about these issues, how do you build kind of momentum within the company to influence the C-suite to really start moving on this?
Let's see. I'll tackle that first. Let's see. It's a good question. I've worked with some clients who have faced internal pressure for sure. That's becoming, I think, a growing source of both anxiety and hopefully change for big companies in particular. I think the advice I would give would be to organize, first internally. So if you're an employee at a mid-level, whether it's a large company or small, find your like-minded, coworkers and colleagues, bring them together. I've seen power emerge from sustainability affinity groups or sustainability clubs within companies. That can be sort of a starting point for an internal movement to demand change. And I guess I would go from there. I think, a lot of companies these days have a lot of avenues for any employee to reach top executives on Slack or, through town hall meetings. And, the only advice I would give is to get organized and create a collective voice from within, as opposed to a few one-offs that are trying to represent the group.
Mm-hmm.
I agree with that. And I think I would just add, get organized and then, I think they're starting to emerge these groups of like market, like how do you use like marketing for climate and engineering? There are these groups emerging across companies of like, tech workers who want to bring their technical or their tech skills back to their company or for climate more broadly. And so, really thinking about like, what does climate need from marketing right now, and what can different roles throughout the company play? And I think climate, like, we shouldn't have to work on this as a side hustle, right? Like climate is something that is like worthy of all of our focus all the time. It's like the biggest endeavor we have ever undertaken as a species. So it should be like, it deserves all of our attention, all of our work, all of our hearts and minds and hands. So I think the more that we can like integrate it into our like pressure, like organize to push your company faster, and also what does your unique role, how does your unique role lend itself to supporting climate? I think it's sort of like a double, approach that could be taken.
Yeah, totally. I mean, it seems, there's so many jobs within companies that touch climate. I mean, even if you're, in R&D for sure, but, even if you were in customer service, I mean, I think each of us can find a touch point to climate with pretty much every job in a company. Can you guys talk a little bit about, we've obviously laid the groundwork for, yes, it's very important for companies to get involved, and here's why. What are some of the other things? I mean, we've talked about politics a little bit, but what are some of the other things that companies should be looking at in terms of weighing in the climate beyond just measuring their emissions?
Yeah, I can get started, and would love to hear Adam's insights as well. But I think, in addition to policy advocacy, and I think that with that comes like not saying anything is not neutral. Like silence is not neutral. Silence is like complicit with the status quo. So like not just being silent, but being vocal as much as possible. But then also, investments. So, I mean, especially large corporations have all kinds of investments that are doing things in the world. And like 401ks for your employees. What are those funding in the world? Looking at that is a really important lever. And then I think, large corporations, like what are their trade associations, Chamber of Commerce, like are you pushing them? Are they aligned with your climate targets? And if not, like, that's an avenue for leveraging your influence. And then, I think this idea of like, how is your business model? Like, how are you using your company's superpower for climate? And I use I think a good example of this is it's Google. They're not necessarily a good example in terms of like policy advocacy yet, but in terms of using their superpower, like they have a commitment to 100% clean energy everywhere they operate 24 hours a day by 2030. And as one of the biggest consumers of energy in the United States, like that will help us electrify that will help green the grid for all the other things that society will need, like electrifying transportation. Like that will help society, as a whole, outside of just Google. So I think there are ways that companies can also look at like, what is my superpower and how can I leverage that in support of climate beyond my own company?
Yeah, I think, Jamie, I love your comments, and you mentioned power. And I think about sort of business action in terms of, what is the power that's available to any given company to act on a certain issue. And I break it down into sort of two areas. I think, first of all, companies don't understand the scope of their power, and they're not very good at learning how to use it. There's direct power, which I think you really spoke to. What's your supply chain look like? How are you organizing your operations? In your product, what are the materials involved? How is it made? All kinds of decisions that can all be made with a climate action focus. And then there's the power to mobilize, which is where I get really excited. In this country, at least, we've lost trust in our institutions. It's, tragic, and it's a huge problem. Government, journalism, politics writ large. People don't trust these institutions. But believe it or not, brands actually have the highest level of trust. It's the only sort of category that's still over 50% trusted. So the fact that a brand can be a trusted voice with, a large array of stakeholders, employees, partners, customers, policymakers, where they have influence and connectivity with all of these audiences, I think that power to mobilize is really sort of the vanguard in the next phase. And I think that's everything from, direct lobbying. I often say, like, someone will ask me, what's the most impactful thing a company, especially a large company, could do? And I say, have your CEO pick up the phone and call the Republican senators that he or she has a relationship with. That would be the biggest thing, because those relationships really matter. But from there, there's funding that can go to the front lines. There's encouraging their employees to take action on behalf of some of these frontline organizations that are really leading on policy action, and especially at the federal level. And then there's mobilizing customers to take action. And that's where it gets fun, I think, because when you make advocacy and purpose-driven action a part of your brand, you start to get deeper relationships with your customers based on shared values. So we know that the vast majority of people care deeply about climate action and are highly concerned. They're going to gravitate towards a brand that is putting that front and center and showing that they're willing to spend resources that are designed for making them money, like their marketing channels, their social media, to ask them to participate in the brand in a different way. It's not sales, it's doing an action, calling a legislator, signing a petition, joining a protest. It's participation towards the goal of solving climate change. That's going to have a huge impact on the brand. Plus, that's where brands get to bring their creativity and their own brand voice to the movement and really add value in a significant way.
And it doesn't have to be just the big brands, right? Because I know, speaking from the winter sports industry, a vast majority of our industry are small and mid-sized brands. But that shouldn't preclude them from doing this kind of work, should it?
Absolutely not. No. And in fact, smaller brands, especially in an industry like Snowsports, have an even deeper connection with their customers and an even higher level of trust. So think about those communities that you have the ability to reach and how you can use that reach to further the climate movement and to build your brand. I always mention those two types of impact side by side, because they're both critical, they're both valuable, and they're both available to any company that has a solid foundation of action to reduce emissions and reach net zero.
Yeah, totally. And I was just looking at one of the comments, and this is a really interesting thought that that Lucy just brought up, and it goes back to, Jamie, your comment about every job being a climate job, is that she had said that what if companies outline in job descriptions the sustainable responsibility of the role and how it contributes to the larger corporate goals? That's cool. And I don't know if a lot of companies are doing that yet, but wouldn't that be cool if companies started thinking about climate change when they started hiring people and letting them know what that responsibility was? So, good idea.
I mean, that is one kind of barometer that I have. Like when I kind of judge a company's climate commitment or kind of look at the authenticity of it, I always look at like how much are they engaging in their employees, or how much are they like welcoming challenges, their employees, like challenging them to move faster. I think that's a great indicator of the authenticity of a company's real commitment to it. So I think that's a great idea. To Lucy's point, I think it is beyond, it's sustainability teams are overworked. They have so much to do. No one has done this before. There's no guidebook for, taking a company and getting their emissions to zero across like every sector on the planet. There's not a guidebook for doing that. So they need help. They need all the like parts of the workforce to come together and help. And they should be welcoming of that. So yeah, love that point from Lucy.
Yeah. It's interesting because a lot of people I've heard would say, well, those companies have it built into their DNA already. They started like that. But I think we're at the point now where we understand that, this window is getting really tight, and we've got to get companies to be bold starting today. How does this start at a company that wasn't really founded on these values? Does it start from the bottom up, the top down, or probably both, right?
I think it's both. And first of all, let me address, I think, the myth that a company has to be founded on these certain principles in order to be able to really embody it. My former employer, Patagonia, spent almost 20 years in existence without fully embracing an environmental mission. That only came along when Yvon Chouinard became aware of the consequences of the products he was making on the planet. And there was the recession in the 80s, which caused the company to sort of rethink a lot of things. So, I think it's easy to say like, well, that company was born with that in their DNA, but it just isn't true. And I point that out just because Patagonia is such an often cited example of companies doing it right. And I think the way it can start is certainly, top down or bottom up, but I would really point to the responsibility of business leaders to start making these changes. I don't think it should be up to employees to force companies to change. I think business leaders, frankly, need to think about their own bottom line and their responsibility to shareholders and their employees and the communities that they serve, and start being more aggressive when it comes to climate action and using both their direct power and their power to mobilize on behalf of these values. I think that has to come top down more than anything.
And I guess if the moral reason for them to do it isn't there, they've got their customers and their employees telling them that it's important to them. And if they don't follow through with that, they're going to lose profit and they're going to not get the employees that they need down the road. So
yeah, I think 84% of Gen Z say they're more likely to buy a product from a socially responsible company. So that tells you something about the future consumers of America. And I think it's something like almost 90% of Americans expect business leaders and companies to speak out on social issues. So this is where businesses are headed, whether your business is, on the leading edge or not. And so I would recommend to any leader that cares about success moving forward to embrace these ideas.
Yeah, and I think if there ever were a perfect moment to kind of look at this kind of like business model transformation, it's now. It's like now when we are, coming out of the craziest year of our lives and businesses have had to shift so much already. Like this is the perfect moment to do that. This is the moment to is your existing sector, are there big sector-wide shifts that need to happen? Do you need to look at your product, are your products aligned? Now's the time we should look at all of it, I think, and undergo that transformation that we need.
Yeah, I know, being in the ski industry, that is the challenge that we have right now because so many companies have not been involved, unfortunately, for so long. But, we're trying to ramp this action up and accelerate it really quickly. And to be able to get companies to understand this broader role that they have is in many ways an easier on-ramp for them than to say, look, you've got to reduce your emissions 100% by 2050. And you've got to do that right now, which is very important. And it's important, but to give them this challenge that they can be this huge force in this change that we need is really an opportunity for them to really dig in. So we've only got just a few more minutes, and let me know, anybody in the audience, if you have any more questions. But Jamie and Adam, what is your vision? If you could look 5 years down the road, I'll keep it short, 5 or 10 years down the road, what would you love to see in terms of engagement on climate?
Jamie?
Okay, I think, 5 or 10 years down the road, I would love to see sort of a shift. And I think, Adam, you touched on this already, but businesses seeing themselves as part of a broader goal, this huge thing that we are undertaking as a global community. And I would love for, kind of the businesses to look outward and say, how am I see, for business leaders to say, like, I am part of this global effort to transform society at the scope and scale that this crisis calls for. And so I'm working with my governments, my communities, my employees, my customers, and we are like engaged in this effort together to not just reduce emissions, but to reimagine our sector or our place in how we use our superpower to help fix this. So I think just like seeing kind of like, I would love to see a shift toward like a global kind of cooperative toward addressing this challenge rather than kind of like one-off internal commitments.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think 100% agree with what Jamie illustrated in terms of a vision. I mean, I think there's two things that really stand out for me. I'd love to see that statistic about 70% of companies, not having an aggressive 2030 climate action plan. Let's flip that around and make sure that 70% of companies do have an aggressive climate action plan and have embraced that. And then I think, while corporate action is 100% needed at every level, small, medium, large businesses, we also do need policy action. And the momentum that we're seeing in Washington is truly exciting. But the level of federal investment and certainty across states and the full spectrum of the country, and requirements and accountability for all actors won't happen without policy change, and that's going to require businesses to step up and really get involved, whether it's publicly or behind the scenes. I think businesses have an opportunity to fundamentally reshift or rethink or reimagine the politics of climate change, because the business community has such an influence with members of Congress, and in particular on the Republican side. So I'd love to see a world in which it's now a bipartisan issue, and the idea of climate action equals jobs has truly broken through across both parties. And we've passed, probably multiple rounds of federal legislation to address climate change.
Yeah, thanks, Adam. So I guess what you're saying is then companies that just assume that with this new administration, it's all going to get done is very short-sighted, right? Very
short-sighted. It's not how it works. I don't know if anyone's paid attention to how much has gotten done. We had the COVID bill, which was great, but it's going to take a lot of work to get just this next infrastructure bill passed, and it's likely to happen through reconciliation. So, let's imagine a world in which both parties are embracing something that will 100% contribute to the success and growth of our economy, and also is a moral and social responsibility.
Yeah. And I think, the snow sports industry, has a really unique role in this because of this shared passion for this issue that we all have. But also our businesses are completely dependent on the impacts of climate change. And from a policy perspective, we have a $73 billion industry, and that's not small by any stretch. And we've got to start using our business policy weight much more effectively than we have been. So that's going to be a big focus of ours as well going forward, the trade groups, but also, giving our members opportunities to really weigh in on ways that fit their business. So measuring emissions is one thing, but all of these solutions that Jamie and Adam just spoke about are on the table for all of our companies in our industry. And, it's my responsibility and it's SIA's responsibility to kind of lead this industry forward in that respect and give everybody kind of a broad set of tools to work with. So does anybody have any more questions? We're kind of up on the hour. I just want to make sure that we stay within our guidelines. But in the meantime, Adam and Jamie, thank you so much for spending time with us. It was really awesome and so cool to hear this perspective, because I think it just really was so important. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. Appreciate it.
Of course. Well, if nobody has any more questions, I think we'll sign off, and always feel free to contact any one of us if anybody has any more questions, and hopefully we can do this again soon.